Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. This season, we're looking at examples of resistance from 6 countries to see what we can learn. Scholars, activists, and politicians will help us understand how leaders attempt to concentrate power and how people fight back. Today, we're focusing on Syria and exploring how a country rebuilds after overthrowing a dictator. The Syrian democracy movement grabbed global headlines in 2011 when they began street protests against the Assad regime, which had ruled as a corrupt and brutal dictatorship for over 50 years. The regime responded with a violent crackdown that triggered a civil war. The war continued until December 8, 2024, when armed forces led by Islamist rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham overthrew the Assad regime. For now, the country's in an in-between phase. What was is gone, but it's not yet clear what's coming next. To help us identify any glimmers of democratic possibility, we're talking with Mohammed Kanfash and Ali al-Jassem. Both are from Syria and work to deliver humanitarian aid to civilians in cities under siege during the civil war. About 10 years ago, they both fled to the Netherlands. Today, Mohammed Kanfash is a PhD candidate at the Center for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University, where he focuses on state-society relations in post-conflict areas in Syria. He also works on sanctions. Ali al-Jassem is a researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University, focusing on paramilitary groups in Syria and on humanitarian aid. Ali visited Syria 1 week after Assad was defeated. Together, we explore what it was like on the ground in the weeks after the Assad regime fell, why it was necessary to have some continuity with the former government in key areas where Syria remains vulnerable. One note, we recorded this interview in late January. Since then, the former leader of the victorious rebel group, Ahmed al-Sharaa, was officially appointed interim president. An interim constitution has been crafted, and there has been large-scale violence led by Assad loyalists. Ali, Mohammed, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget, for this opportunity, and we really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you both. So before we dive into the meat of the conversation, I wanted to touch on something that might be unexpected for our audience. So in my experience, working on other conflicts, people often survive awful conditions through humor. And I'm curious if this holds for Syrians. Mohammed, I want to start with you. If you have any examples from while you were living in Syria.
I can't remember the exact date. It was somewhere in 2013. That's before I left Syria. I was with a group of other activists, and we were trying to help friends, family members who were stranded in Eastern Ghouta. This is an area that was besieged by the Assad forces because they rebelled, because they were calling for the fall of the regime. And the regime has encircled the whole area. No food, no medicine was allowed. So we were trying to get some medical supplies via car and via other options. But sometimes, occasionally, these medical supplies needed to go through a tunnel. And we arrived to the one side of the tunnel. For some reason, they chose to give me a small bag. It felt a bit warm. And I thought, okay, I have zero background in medics or in medicine. And so I thought it must be much more important than the whole, like the bigger bags, because they only gave me a small thing and they told me to take care of it. And long story short, you go through this tunnel, which, by the way, goes underneath the sewage system. And I vividly remember the sewage dripping. You reach the end of the tunnel and then you have to run for some 15 meters. And that's exactly you run for your life because there was a sniper. So I did that. I made it to the other side. I was looking to someone to give them the bag, and then somebody took it from me, and I was wondering, what is it? And then, no worries, that's a hot meal that my mother wanted to send to me because it's been such a long time that I have had something warm. So I still can't forgive them for doing that to me. But that shows that in conflict, Mothers still mothers, and they still want to give their kids warm meals when that's possible. But people still do that. They still do crazy stuff when you're trying to get these medical supplies. So that's it on my side.
I picture you carrying this bag like it's a little infant child, the most important creature on earth, and it's a hot lunch.
Yes, indeed.
Ali, I know you've just returned from your first trip back to Syria in quite some time. Did you find any new forms of humor that were emerging in this new aftermath?
Indeed. I arrived in Damascus 1 week after the Assad was toppled. One joke that stood out to me involves the current currency notes, which feature pictures of Assad, the father, and the son. And when asking for payment, for example, if the price is the 3,000, they would say it's 2 donkeys and a mule. So that was totally forbidden. I mean, even to mention the names or to refer to the presidents. But now they are being openly named in their actual kind
And
of
mocked.
indeed, which was unbelievable to hear after 54 years of dictatorship. Now people are calling these names publicly and openly. So there was a cultural shock, to be honest.
I like to because it also tells us exactly what the moment is, right? It's this in between where the banknotes still have the dictator's face on it,
Indeed.
but you mock them, but there's still not this new currency. And I don't know who's going to be on the new currency. Maybe a tree or something more innocuous. Mohammed, who is this new government? Can you set the scene for us? How did they come into power and when did they do it?
This is a group that people know as HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is a former associate of al-Qaeda. They disassociate from al-Qaeda some years ago. They were governing a part in northwestern Syria in an area called Idlib, and they were running their own government called the Salvation Government on the 8th of December, being the strongest group that has taken over Damascus in agreement with other participating groups. They reinstated those that were in Idlib in Damascus. So we have a caretaker government with the ministers who are running the everyday life. And this is supposed to continue until the 1st of March, when we're supposed to have a more inclusive government representative of various sectors of the society.
So, how are the remnants of the Assad regime? What still remains in place?
One of the main worries that the international community and the Syrian people had actually is the dismantling of the state, because that was a worry that if the regime falls, the state would collapse. So the best thing the new caretaker government did was actually to reach out to the prime minister, to the ministers, to tell them, guys, you stay in a place. Senior officials, civil servants are still in their place. So the ministries, the services are running normally to avoid the void in the services, in supplies, etc. So that was a successful transitional phase and very peaceful, because there was also no resistance from the older government.
And this is where the distinction between the regime and the state and the government comes into play. You'd hear the previous prime minister saying that even though my family was telling me to just escape and run away, and by the way, he had been only in position for 2 months, so he hadn't committed many crimes, if let's say that he was planning to commit any. But he wanted to prioritize the well-being of the population. He decided that I would make this Facebook call to the new rulers that, look, listen, I'm going to stay. I'm happy and willing to work on an orderly transfer of power, transition vis-a-vis the regime. And that is the Assad family and their close associates who just simply disappeared. They stole the money, they stole the hardware, they took the jets, they flew from Syria to Russia and left everyone behind. That takes me to a small comment on the question by identifying those as remnants of the older regime. These are members of the state institution. Yes, they needed to work with the previous regime. Many of them will be probably engaged in corruption and will have many other ethical issues about their conduct, about how they made it to where they are. I don't argue about that, but I really want to emphasize the distinction between this regime that was sucking the blood out of the state institution, out of the population, and these individuals who sometimes out of opportunistic reasoning or for many other reasons work in the various practices and run the country. We all know they ran it badly. Corruption was rampant. The economy was bad, but that's what they did.
Are schools functioning? The electricity is running, buses show up. Are those types of things functioning?
Institutions continue to operate in many areas better than they used to. Schools have reopened, hospitals are running, everything is in comparison to the past is still as it is. When we address issues such as electricity, unfortunately, there is no improvement. People had 1 hour of electricity in the past. They still continue to have 1 hour of electricity every 8-10 hours, which is disastrous if you're running a business or if you have to study or if you have to prepare for an exam. That has to do with sanctions, the import of fuel, the fact that the US and its proxy are occupying the oil fields of Syria. So the central state cannot use its own oil. And until recently, until December the 8th, Syria was getting its oil from Iran. That's no more. Iran was a friend, now it's a foe. So that has brought with it a lot of challenges in terms of electricity, in terms of running schools, running hospitals. There was recently, the US said some of the sanctions on Syria, we will ease them so the country can import some fuel, and some of it is trickling to the country, but it hasn't made a huge improvement in people's lives.
Yeah. Mohammed, so why is the US still occupying a Syrian oil field?
Thanks for posing the question, by the way. Not many people know or understand that actually a very large chunk of the Syrian land is occupied by the US. And interestingly, when you read about it in the media or in books, it's never called an occupation. It's the US presence or American forces in Syria. Anyway, the US has been occupying parts of Syria for such a long time. The bombing of Syria started in 2014 under the war on ISIS. We still have US forces. They're still occupying parts of Syria. In 2020, when Syria was only had about what was a grain sufficient for some 6 weeks, the US was preventing its proxy from sending grains to Damascus, threatening to actually starve Syrians. Those who are working with the Americans have control over the oil, over the grain, over most of the natural resources of the country. And that's why actually Syrians don't have electricity. Of course, there are many other reasons, but we have less hours that we can produce because of the occupation. And Trump, the new president of the US, unfortunately, has even called for the US to stay there and take the oil. So I don't believe necessarily that the US is there for the oil because it's insignificant. It's something that Texas can produce in half an hour, but it's mostly about geostrategic calculation, Iran, Israel, and the lobby groups in the US.
So, Mohammed, to what extent are people seeing and feeling and engaging with the state?
People are engaging a new type of a state. I was just calling someone and talking to someone in Damascus, and they simply couldn't explain their feeling around the checkpoint. There are still checkpoints on the street, this time manned by new faces. So they still represent the state, the heavy presence of the state, but they are much more friendlier. They're much more in touch with the people. But that also represents a dilemma for for the everyday civilian. How do I engage with them?
Mm-hmm.
And do I smile at them? We don't do that at checkpoints. Do I crack a joke, or should I exchange words with them, or what do I do? So yes, these are things that are still I can say are taking place, unfolding as we speak.
Mohammed, before you go on, can you explain for us why are there still checkpoints in Syria? What's the purpose of them?
So you have this new group in power, a lot of weapons in people's hands. So like revenge killing. Luckily, it's not happening on a large scale, but it could still happen. So you do need people on the ground to make sure that people understand that this is not the wild, wild west, that there are still certain rules that you need to follow. Plus, they also have this security reasoning behind it. I don't want to sound as somebody who's defending the presence of these checkpoints or the group, but from what I hear, the reflections on these checkpoints are quite positive, and they've been making a lot of good intervention against those who are trying to break the rules and orders.
It brought to mind, an encounter that I had while crossing like a checkpoint. I mean, crossing a checkpoint during the times of the regime was the adrenaline rush gets high, paranoia, all the scenarios of being arrested, ending up in a prison like Sidnaya, which is called the death factory. And now crossing a checkpoint by the new authorities, it is such, back then you feel insecure, now you feel safe. I mean, I remember passing by a checkpoint and together with the driver, we had a driver, and when he passed by a checkpoint, he said, I want to kiss your forehead. I want to hug you. Because you don't know what we were going through just last week, just 10 days ago. So you can see how even the perception of a checkpoint changed from one authority to the other, from insecurity to feeling safe.
Bridget, this would have been impossible if I was in Syria. I remember once being at a checkpoint where we needed to wait for 2 hours and a half simply because the soldier did not feel like letting people go.
Yeah.
This type of nonsense taking place on checkpoints. This is not people being killed. This is not being fearful. This is just about losing 1/4 of your productive day.
Yeah. So Ali, tell us more about what's happening in cafes and on the street. How are people debating politics, debating life in Syria differently?
It was fascinating to see how cafes, restaurants have turned actually into political forums. You see daily lectures, workshops, calls for people to come together and to discuss how the new Syria, the future should or would look like. So these are all hopeful encounters that you can see despite the dysfunctioning economy of the country.
Mm. But continuing to have those conversations and have them publicly and in a lively setting where people can speak freely is really important.
Yeah, it is like a 1984 context before the 8th of December, where walls have ears. People, even if they want to discuss anything, they whisper, like from one individual to individual. After the 8th of December, like in every single cafe or restaurant, you see people coming together, discussing politics, disagreeing with the statement that the new authority made today, not fearing, they would be arrested for just saying their opinion, turning the public space into a forum, which is something totally new to the Syrian political scene.
Mohammed, what about from your perspective? Are people's concerns being heard and listened to?
I have to say yes to both questions. However, saying something and being listened to, it might be useful psychologically or as a way of relief, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are being solved.
Uh-huh.
And this is what people really need. People don't. It's not about making a complaint because Syrians could do that prior to December. So if you had an issue with services, you could still raise that up, and there will probably be someone who would listen to you. What Syrians need right now is solutions. I think there is a collective will by everyone to find the solutions. And what's unique about this new administration is that it's trying to involve its societal partners, NGOs, local elites in finding the solutions. What Ali was saying about cafes being these new forums for political engagement, it's indeed a new political environment, but also a new culture. What is it that you can say? How can you say it? I don't want to repeat the words of Ahmed al-Sharaa, the person in charge, but what he said about there's a difference between the mentality of a revolution and the mentality of a state building. And now, to bring an example, a few days after the takeover of Damascus, there were a few protests demanding an inclusive and democratic government. But I think, at least from what I see, is that these people have realized that I don't need to protest this at this moment. I can just go and talk to those in power and tell them what I want. So there is really also for people to shift from that mentality of this is a revolution, we want to go to the street, or we will be working secretly, into no, this is a new type of political regime. Call it what you want to call it. This is a new experiment that people from both sides, this is not to say that those who have taken over are experienced or know what to do. No, there are many mistakes that they've done, or that, at least in my own eyes, in my own analysis, I don't agree with. But they are open to the public. The public is trying to engage with them. Also, there is I wouldn't say a large segment of the population, but there are specific segments within the population who are a bit wary about this group. Take the Christian, let's use that word, minority. Okay, how do we engage with an Islamist al-Qaeda group? Do we go through embassies, which is the way it used to happen, or do we simply go and talk to them? And more of the latter is taking place, which is positive for everyone in the country.
So you've both described a scene where there are some fundamental shifts in the relationship and expectations, and people are still feeling out exactly how things work, but generally positive. There are clearly a lot of obstacles as well. Mohammed, let's start with you. What are the biggest immediate challenges for building a more democratic Syria?
I think the biggest threat to a good governance, a democratic governance in the future, is whether the Syrian state can weather this storm, yes or no. And currently, the state as an entity is under a lot of pressure. It's under a lot of pressure because of the bad economy, because of what is expected of it. It's under a lot of pressure because of the sanctions. Some movement has been made on that, but it's also under a lot of pressure from external intervention. We already mentioned the American occupation of northeast Syria, the separatist group that they support, but also the occupation that is coming from the genocidal regime in the south, Israel. They have occupied part of Syria. They have carpet bombed actually Syria, destroying the armed forces equipments.
And Mohammed, that was just in the last few weeks, right?
Indeed. We're not talking about the occupation that has been taking place since the 1960s. No, this is a recent wave of aggression against the country. You know it more than anyone else. You are in the US now. We have Trump. That is also something that would increase the pressure on Syria, because unfortunately, I don't see the administration making its own assessment away from the Israeli assessment, which is the way US policy takes place in the region, especially with regards to Syria. So all of that is putting a lot of pressure on the state apparatuses. And in order to keep everything in check, you need a good state. You need a functioning state. And that is, I think, one of the most pressing challenges that we need to address at the moment.
Is how to protect the state from those outside forces.
Outside, but also in internal challenges that the state is facing. 90% of the people live under the poverty line. The state here plays a very different role from the role of the state in the UK or in the US. So the state is the central piece for the provision of electricity, for political transition, anything that we can think of. The state and its apparatuses are a key in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Another challenge is corruption and nepotism. The old habits of corruption and nepotism could resurface. Justice and accountability are also crucial to breaking the cycle of violence. Without addressing past injustices, the cycle of violence could continue. Social divisions are also a great challenge. The sectarian and ethnic divisions could lead to further conflict. We have different minority groups. We have also ethnic groups with different agendas. So this is very important to have a sincere and transparent dialogue on the form of the state, the form of the government in the future.
Before we go to our last prepared question, I wanted to ask, I know the two of you know each other very well, and you're friends and colleagues. What do the two of you argue about when you get together and you're talking about where Syria is and where it's going? Where do you guys differ in what you think about the future? Mohammed, I'll let you jump in first.
At some point, we were arguing about who is the next president, but I was going to let Ali have it.
No way.
I have to say, for whatever has been happening since the 8th of December, we're pretty much on the same page. Before the 8th of December, we had like some nuanced differences. I was actively working on sanctions, which Ali supports, but of course he was always cautioning me about perception, about how would I be seen as somebody would be arguing on behalf of the Assad regime that sanctions were bad, that sanctions were hurting the ordinary civilians. But beyond that, I have to say we're pretty much on the same page. We were good colleagues sitting in the same office. So even if there are some points that we don't agree on, we bring each other coffee, so we keep it.
That's a very good model for disagreements. Ali, what about you? Were you going to allow Mohammed to be president?
Absolutely. I mean, with all means. One of the disagreements that we were having before is what to call the regime. Actually, I insisted on calling it regime. Muhammad was always hesitant on calling it a government or a state, and now we are hopeful that we would build a sovereign and a transparent government that runs a state.
You know, Bridget, what brings us together and, a way of thinking is that we're both critical of, luckily, I have to say, we're not attached to a group or we're not attached to an individual. So we're usually critical of policies or okay with the policy. Yes, we strongly identified against Assad regime, against his family, but we remained critical of what those quote-unquote opposition in northern Syria were doing, in northeast was doing. Ideology is something that I may not agree with on an individual basis, but that has no or should have no impact on the assessment of their policies. And this is what brings me and Ali quite a lot on the same page, but also with others. You know what they say, birds of a feather flock together. And
Yeah. Thank you. So our last question. Syria was governed as a dictatorship under the Assad family since 1970. So that's a long time in terms of how long the government stays in power. But in historical terms, 55 years, right, it's barely a blink. So if we're going to blink again, and let's look another 55 years into the future, so it's 2080, Syria enjoys peace. It has a responsive government and its people have built a resilient economy. So what do we do in our lifetimes to get to that future? Ali, let's start with you.
Oh, that's the 1 million question. So, reflecting on what we did in our lifetime. First, promoting inclusive governance. We worked tirelessly to establish a government that is transparent, accountable, and inclusive. We prioritized investing in education and healthcare. We focused on rebuilding the economy through sustainable development, supporting local businesses, and attracting international investment. We implemented strong anti-corruption measures and promoted a culture of integrity. We encouraged unity and cooperation among different communities, promoting dialogue and understanding. And the final point, I leave some areas for Muhammad, but the final one is ending the Israeli occupation of Syrian land.
Thank you. Mohammed?
I want to start with the last point that Ali was saying. He stole my point. You see, like, you try to be nice to him, bring him coffee, but he still steals your
Sorry.
point. You can't be prosperous and free if your land is occupied. And I'm not talking only about Golan and the other areas, but also what we have in Northeast. The Americans, these needs to end. I actually think also with active military preparation. I don't think, or at least I'm not aware of an occupation that decided to just close the door and leave because out of goodwill. So this is our land. We should not be shy about advocating for getting it, take what it may. I think if we were together prioritizing the next generation, we should be able to do it. Ali has come up with this nice list, but I'm not as good as Ali, and that's it.
I stole
Yeah.
your points. So, yeah.
Well, as long as there's still an exchange of coffee at the end of the day, we know it will be all right. So until then, until 2080, there's a lot of work to do. And I think Syria will be the better for the two of you working on those issues. So I'd like to thank both of you for joining me for the conversation.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for the nice conversation.
Thanks a lot, Bridget.
Ali and Mohammed described a Syrian society that's enjoying new freedoms, even while they desperately need to see living conditions improve and foreign forces leave. But one thing that really struck me was how they talked about the difference between the state and the regime. So while they debated how much you can tease the two apart, broadly speaking, the regime is the layer of control that the Assad family asserted over the state. And one can think about the state as the governing infrastructure necessary for a peaceful transition. Even when a corrupt regime falls, there still needs to be a state that can keep the schools and banks open, make sure that trash is picked up, and get electricity to people. Despite all of its challenges, Syria has avoided the chaos that results when new leaders abruptly dismantle a state. The real work in a democratic transition is managing major change while keeping an eye on the prize, improving conditions for people across the country. Something countries outside of Syria should keep in mind. Thanks for listening to Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Mohammed Kanfesh and Ali Al-Jassem through the website of the University of Utrecht and on LinkedIn. We'll include those links in our show notes. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we're going to hear what it's like to lead a country without a military. Straight from the source, one of our guests is Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the former president of Costa Rica.
The funny thing is that when you are born and raised in a country without an army, it's actually hard to imagine what having an army is like. For us, from our perspective, you have these needs on education, you have needs on healthcare, you have poverty that you need to tackle. And to even think to invest in an artillery or in an aircraft that might have missiles or a tank, that itself, from our perspective, it's a crime, because how can you invest in something like that where there are other needs?
Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org. And we've moved from X to Blue Sky, where you can find us at worldpeacefdtn.bsky.social. You can also find us on Instagram at worldpeacefdtn. The show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw, engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson, marketing and social media by Emily Room, show artwork by Simon Fung. Special thanks to Jeremy Helton, my colleagues Lisa Avery, B. Arneson, and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio, including Kimberly Lynn Ferrero-Arnias and Miles Donovan. Okay, until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.